Good. Okay, today we're going to talk about, I'm good as well, thank you. I'm very well. Today we're going to talk about Shakespeare's The Tempest. Shakespeare is an incredibly famous playwright from England. He is considered to be one of the greatest writers of the English language ever. And he's famous for writing plays such as Romeo and Juliet, Measure for Measure, The Tempest, and many, many more. Now, on today's agenda, we're going to look at the author and historical context that goes behind this play. We're going to look at the setting, the genre, because the genre is quite a tricky one to understand, to put your finger on. We're going to look at the characters, then we're going to look at the relationships, then we're going to look at some theatre versions of this play and interpretations of this play, and then finally we will look at the character of Prospero. So just to begin, Nino, have you read The Tempest by any chance? Or have any of you read The Tempest or know the story about The Tempest? No, okay. Do any of you, and the other person who's listening? Okay. So The Tempest, it's considered one of, I suppose if you haven't read it, I better start and give you a sort of a rough overview of what The Tempest is about. Perhaps I can show you a YouTube video, just to give you some context of what this one's about. I'm just looking for the correct thing. Okay. And this will give you a good sort of summary of what The Tempest is about. Okay.
Prospero was the Duke of Milan and had a brother named Antonio. Prospero was a deeply loved duke, but unfortunately, he naively put his trust in his brother Antonio. Prospero allowed Antonio to manage the kingdom for many years, but Antonio wanted more and sought to kill Prospero to steal his kingdom and wealth. Antonio decided to not kill Prospero, but to exile him. He did this with the help of Prospero's arch nemesis, Alonso, who was the king of Naples. Antonio took Prospero out to sea and then left him on a deserted island along with his daughter Miranda. However, there was hope for Prospero. On the larger vessel that Prospero and Miranda were forced off of, Prospero had a loyal ally named Gonzalo. While he could do nothing to save the Duke, he could help out. With that, he secretly placed in the boat some fresh water, food, clothes, and books. The island that they were cast off to was a magical island. For years, the island was under the spell of the now dead witch named Sycorax. She had imprisoned all the good spirits inside trunks of trees on the island. One of those spirits was Ariel. This was an interesting opportunity for Prospero, since he was a great magician. It turns out that when Antonio was managing the kingdom, Prospero was devoted to the study of magic. He set out on the quest of freeing the spirits and was successful. He kept the spirits obedient to his will, but treated them relatively fairly. The one spirit he treated badly was named Caliban. He was the son of the wicked old witch. Caliban was also a vicious, horrible monster. Many years later, a boat carrying Antonio, Alonso, with Sebastian, his brother, and Ferdinand, his son, were at sea together with old Gonzalo, and their ship came near Prospero's island. Prospero, knowing they were there, raised a great storm and caused even the best sailors to give themselves up for lost. The first among them was Prince Ferdinand, who leaped into the sea, followed by the rest of the crew. The spirit Ariel saved Ferdinand, and the rest were brought ashore by the strong waves. Hilariously, the ship was perfectly intact. It was anchored at the exact place where they had abandoned ship. Prospero shows his daughter all of this. He also tells her her life story and how they came to be marooned on this island. Then, Prospero knocks Miranda out with magic, as he has work to do with Ariel. Ariel wants to be set free from Prospero, but Prospero reminds him of the ghoulish fate he was saved from. Prospero says that if Ariel does what he's commanded, then he'll be set free. Ariel goes to carry out Prospero's commands and lures Ferdinand to Prospero with sweet music. Miranda and Ferdinand mutually fall in love. Prospero was delighted, but called Ferdinand a spy anyways. Prospero puts a charm on Ferdinand and makes him carry thousands of logs. Miranda falls deeper in love with Ferdinand and would have helped him carry the logs, but she was forbidden. Finally, Ferdinand is released from the spell. Even more, Prospero allows Ferdinand to marry Miranda. Meanwhile, Antonio and Sebastian, in another part of the island, were plotting the murder of Alonso, the king of Naples. Since they thought Ferdinand was dead, Sebastian would succeed to the throne on Alonso's death. And they would have carried out the murder, but Ariel woke Alonso in time. Ariel plays many tricks on the group, even tricking their eyes into seeing a banquet. Just before they can eat, Ariel snatches it away. Ariel criticizes them for their sins, and then vanishes himself. Then Prospero summons them to his side of the island. When they arrive, they are all trembling and afraid. They're deeply sorry for their sins that they've committed. Then Prospero breaks his staff and throws his magical book into the ocean. He goes on to tell the three about the extremely difficult life he and Miranda have had on that island. Alonso, the king of Naples, was the most distraught and sorry of them all. He was so sorry because he believed that he had lost his dear son, Ferdinand. But Prospero pulled back a curtain that revealed Miranda and Ferdinand happily playing chess. Alonso was overwhelmed and cried out, "Give me your hands. Let grief and sorrow still embrace his heart that doth not wish you joy." But to everyone's surprise, everything ended happily. The ship was safe in the harbor, and the next day they all set sail for Naples, where Ferdinand and Miranda were to be married. Ariel gave them calm seas and good winds. The wedding itself was joyous and lovely. Then Prospero, after many years of absence, went back to being Duke of Milan. He was welcomed with happiness by his faithful subjects. When he went back to Milan, he stopped practicing magic and lived a very happy life. One big reason for his happiness was that even when his worst enemies had tried to kill him, he didn't take vengeance. Instead, he forgave them. As for Ariel, Prospero set him free so that he could wander the earth and sing. The end.
Okay. So, we roughly understand what's going on in the story. It's about a Duke of Milan who is sent away to an island with his daughter. And turns out this island, it's a magical island where there used to be this witch Sycorax, but Alonso defeats her, and then he learns all about her magic. And now Prospero, he's like a magician. He understands how the island works, and he enslaves Ariel and Caliban, who are some of the sort of creatures among many other creatures on this island. Now, let's just bear in mind the historical context behind this story, and not to remember the background in which Shakespeare is writing, which is basically the expansion of the British Empire and colonialism. And Britain is now already going to different islands, colonizing them. Australia's been colonized. It's quite a amazing time in that sense, that Britain's expanding and discovering new parts of the world, completely different parts of the world. And it's said that Shakespeare, he was inspired to write the story when he received, he found a letter written by a sailor who had gone to a tropical island and seen a tribe, and he described them that like they were like savages, like cannibals almost. There was a huge desire at the time, especially in Britain, to know more about places outside of Britain. There was a real curiosity, and so when Shakespeare wrote this play and showed it to people, it was a huge success. Now the setting, it's set on an island somewhere probably in the Pacific. Sorry, in the Atlantic Ocean. And the island, it's quite ambiguous. Remember, this is a play, so it's very interpretable what the island looks like, what it feels like. But I suppose that sort of allows directors of the play to give their own interpretation for the setting. And there have been many different settings used for the Tempest in the theatrical versions, and we'll talk about that later, all the different interpretations and how this play has been done in terms of theatre. Now the genre is very strange, and people often say that this is Shakespeare's problem play, and the reason it's Shakespeare's problem play is because it has lots of humor, but it also has some really serious topics. It's also a romance, but it's also tragedy. It's a play that you can't put into a box, and there's lots of different examples of this. But for example, it's a romance because the story revolves around Prospero's daughter and, I believe, Antonio's son falling in love with each other. It's also a comedy because there's lots of jokes. I'm just trying to remember a funny scene. Anyway, when you get the chance to watch the play, you'll understand that it's also got lots of humor, but it's also in a way tragic because it's not clear which characters are good and which characters are bad, and the supposedly bad characters actually they come out worse at the end of the play. But certain interpretations suggest that that's the tragic element of this play, that actually they're not bad characters. And Shakespeare's trying to sympathize with certain characters who seem bad. And I'll talk about those characters in a moment. So these are some of the characters you've got. And you've got Prospero over here with his magic stick, his sort of wand, and that's his daughter. And Prospero, he can control the whole island. He can control the forests, he can control the spirits, and he is helped by Ariel, who's like a fairy with wings, quite often depicted as like a transsexual, like you neither male or female, something in between it. So she is always a very weird character, and it's either played by men or women. It can be both. And Ariel, generally, what Prospero does, he gets Ariel to conjure up this storm, so that this ship, which has Antonio on it, the ship will be forced to crash on the island, and they'll be forced to come onto the island. Now, the other person in this play, the other character, is Caliban, who is Prospero's slave. And Caliban is the son of Sycorax, who's the witch. Caliban's sort of, he's not really human. He's more of a beast. He's more of a monster, something like that. And he's treated incredibly badly by Prospero. He is literally his slave. And there's multiple different reasons for that. One of which, Caliban, when they were young, when Caliban was young, actually Prospero and Caliban had a really good relationship. And Caliban explains how there's a scene, a really strong scene, where Caliban's basically telling Prospero, you used to love me, you used to be like my father. But then what happened was that Caliban tried to basically, to put it lightly, try to rape Prospero's daughter, and Prospero was obviously not okay with that, and ever since he's made his life really terrible and really hard. The thing is, remember the colonial context, and remember that Ariel and Caliban are native to the island. So we're starting to see a theme here, and it's really interesting. It seems that there's a commentary going on about colonialism. That Prospero has come to this island, and he has basically enslaved the natives there. Yet the story kind of describes them as bad people, but are they really bad people? Perhaps they're just resentful because they've been enslaved by Prospero, who is an Italian colonialist, right? So perhaps there's an interesting commentary going on here about colonialism, discrimination, slavery. And the reason why you might think that when you watch this play is because of the elegance and beauty with which Caliban speaks. He's an incredibly emotionally in touch individual who describes the nature around him as beautiful. He loves the nature around him. He loves poetry, he loves art, he loves music, but he's very bitter and resentful towards Prospero. Right. And there's also often quite an uncomfortable depiction of Prospero and Ariel. Again, this all depends on the interpretation of the play, but very often you feel this uncomfortable sort of power imbalance between Prospero and Ariel. That Prospero really dominates it, and there's almost like a certain sort of how to put this in an appropriate way, a sort of sexual tension between them, a very uncomfortable one, because she's often depicted as younger and sort of more vulnerable. Anyway, so again, focusing on this relationship, here's an image of Prospero and Caliban. Caliban is always depicted, he's quite low on his feet, and he always looks up towards Prospero because he is inferior to Prospero, because Prospero has ultimate power over him. And Caliban knows there's nothing he can do about it. But then later on in the play, things get interesting when basically Caliban sees these men arrive on the island, and he realizes maybe he can get them to kill Prospero for him. In the end, he fails, and he is subject to enslavement for the rest of his life. But again, lots of modern day critics, when they read Prospero's character, they think that actually he's the character with which we should sympathize most. Although back in those times, Caliban would have been looked at as a sort of someone to laugh at. He would have been the comic relief, someone pathetic. But it's one thing what the audience thinks, and it's another, I suppose, what Shakespeare would have thought. Now, Shakespeare, he conducts his plays in the Globe Theatre. And bear this in mind, this is a play about a magical island with magical characters, lots of hallucinations, flying beasts, flying fairies. How on earth would they have been able to do that in an old theatre where they don't have pyrotechnics, they don't have lighting, they don't have any technology, right? So what I want us to think about now, and perhaps you guys can have a go at this, is how do you think they would have done this play in the Globe Theatre? How do you think they would have created effects? How do you think, actually, the best one I can ask is, how do you think they would have created the storm? Because the opening scene of The Tempest is this huge storm with lightning. Ariel is controlling the storm, and the men are on the ship, basically trying not to fall off the ship, and they're clinging on for dear life. That's the opening scene of The Tempest. How do you think that was done in a theatre 200 or 300 years ago, whenever it was? How would you have created a storm with no technology in a theatre like this? This is the Globe Theatre. And while you're thinking, maybe I can tell you a bit about the Globe Theatre. As you can see, there's no roof. Sound effects. Okay, what do you mean? How would you create those sound effects of a storm? How would you create them? Remember, you're living in Shakespeare's day and you've got no technology. So how might you have done that? So sound effects, one thing I learned, which I found really interesting. In the Globe Theatre here, above the stage, you've got this small like roof, it's like a canopy, teepee or whatever. And to create the noise of thunder, rumbling thunder and lightning, what they would do, they'd get a big metal sheet, they place it above the roof, and they would have a cannon. You know what a cannon is? They would push a cannon over the metal sheet and it'd go, and it was sort of and it was really effective. And for people in those days, it would have been like the best technology ever. They'd be so impressed with something like that. Sound effects also, like, you can create soundscapes. You can have actors around the theatre sort of making whispering noises, making sort of rain noises with their mouths. The point is, they had to be really creative when they were doing a lot of this stuff. Now, in terms of the ship, let me see if I can demonstrate this actually physically. If I can see myself. In terms of the ship, what they would do, you'd be on the ship. The entire stage would be the ship, and they'd have ropes that had fallen down from the ceiling, like ropes on the ship. And basically, all the actors, they use their physicality to give the idea of a swaying ship. So in the beginning, it sort of starts like this, and then it gets more intense, and then they also sort of start falling over. Okay, some 101 acting lessons there. So they would use their physicality, they'd use ropes, they'd use sound effects, but it was very effective, and people, when they watched this back then, they felt like they were being transported to almost like another world. I mean, modern day versions are insanely, they use so much technology that sometimes when I watch them, and I've seen lots of versions of The Tempest, I'm kind of like, yeah, you could have done that scene, but in a much more simple way, in a way that wouldn't be that distracting. Because what I find with those is you become completely in awe of the technology and you sort of forget the play itself. Anyway. Cheers. Yeah, I've been practicing my swaying all day just for you guys. So, I mean, the other thing to know, I mean, we will look at the Globe Theatre more in the up and coming sessions, because we'll be looking at Shakespeare this month, generally speaking. But as you can see, open roof, so plays had to be during the day. They couldn't be held at night. What else is interesting about the Globe? You can stand around the stage. This is called, I forgot what this is called, but this is essentially, you could either sit or you could stand, and this is basically for the common people. For poor people would have to stand, and the richer folk would have their own sort of boxes. And I think that's the royal box up here, where the queen or the king would sit. Yeah, and the original Globe Theatre actually burnt down, but then they made a sort of recreation, which is now in London, by the river, and I've been there a couple of times. And it really is like, it's amazing because it's such an old-looking theatre. In fact, this theatre, the way it's built, it's not even built using nails. The whole structure, basically, what they did was they had wet wood, and then they sort of pushed the wet wood together like this, somehow into different holes and stuff. And then when it would dry, it would expand. Sorry, it would shrink. And it's basically put together like that. It's put together without any nails. So now this is what I mean by the more technology-based versions. The stage is huge. You're sort of underneath a ship, and actually this version uses lots of different types of lighting effects, but also this one uses CGI. So this is Ariel, who's the fairy. In this version, it's a man. They actually use CGI'd Ariel, who flies around the whole stage. So they sort of CGI him up there and over there. He sort of moves around the place. And it was cool, but I'm like, yeah, you know, whatever. Yeah, I guess. I don't know. So, but there's lots of different versions of the Tempest, and there's lots of different ways you can do it. You can actually, a lot of people have put the Tempest into a modern context. So I actually went to see this. They actually set this Tempest put in a prison, an all-women's prison, right? To be honest with you, it didn't really make any sense, but it kind of worked. And basically, Prospero here is played by a woman, and this is Prospero's daughter, but Prospero's daughter is just basically another inmate. Okay, and Caliban in the prison version is like played is a janitor. You know what a janitor is, like someone who cleans the place. So you can basically almost like transpose an old play into like a modern context, and this has been done in multiple different ways. I mean, when I was studying theatre at school, we had to write our own version of the Tempest, where we had to come up with our own sort of setting. We had to choose who the characters would be, and I decided to set my version of the Tempest in Australia during the time when Britain went over and colonized it and killed the majority of the Aboriginal people there. And I'd probably have Caliban and Ariel as Aboriginal Australians, well, not Australians, as Aborigines, while Prospero might be like a British colonialist, and so all the other guys. And I think that you could use sort of the nature of Australia, and they have also quite a lot among Aboriginal people. There is a lot of this sort of magic and witchcraft, which would work as well. So maybe while I'm talking, maybe you guys can think of your own version of the Tempest. Where would you set it? What would be your interpretation? Would it be a colonialist interpretation, or will it be more of a comedy where actually there's less emphasis on the colonialism present? And finally, the thing worth mentioning here is the similarity of Shakespeare and Prospero. And this is why it's a really interesting play. One interpretation says that basically this is Shakespeare metaphorically explaining what it's like to be a playwright. The island is the stage. The island is the Globe Theatre, and all the characters on the island are his actors. And Prospero if Prospero is Shakespeare, that makes sense, because Prospero dictates what everyone does, and he's always ahead of step of everyone, and he always knows what's going on. But also, similarly, it's kind of like he's sort of expressing certain regret in this play, regret about being a playwright, regret about the industry, the theatre industry, and some of the bad characters who turn up in the theatre industry. And him leaving the island is almost like a suggestion that he's done writing plays. It's caused him too many troubles. It's caused him too many problems. And he's been trapped on this island by people who sent him there. But the people who sent him there are basically the audience. It's the audience who's trapped him on this island. It's the audience that has trapped him in the theatre. That makes sense. I seriously recommend, when you get the chance, to watch either a film version or maybe to try and find a theatrical version. And perhaps I'll try in the following days to find a free accessible version of the Tempest, and if you guys want to see it, I'll send it to you guys. Right, do we have any questions, anything we want to say at all? Any questions about the Tempest or Shakespeare in general?